Before we get, I'll introduce him. In just 1 second, I will introduce Dr. Ringer, but in the meantime, I just want to go over a couple housekeeping things. This session does have an active Q&A and chat. Feel free to use both. We will get to any questions you have at the end of the session, so feel free to put them in along the way. And if there's something that's timely, I will sort of jump in, but for the most part, I'll be behind the scenes and it'll be just Dr. Ringer until the end, and we'll get to the questions then. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce Dr. Ringer. Dr. Ringer is a professor in management in the Department of Management and Quantitative Methods and director of the organizational leadership both here at ISU. His expertise area includes leadership, organizational behavior, management history, and organizational change. As the director of the Institute, Dr. Ringer's responsibilities include managing a variety of leadership development programs and activities for both College of Business students, as well as our local business community. So we are grateful to have Dr. Ringer with us. And with that, Dr. Ringer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Jamie, thank you. And welcome to each of you. What makes me so excited is to see former students logged on, mostly because I feel like I didn't screw you up when you were a student and you're still interested in being affiliated with the university. I'm really excited about this session. It's a sensitive issue. It's a really difficult issue in a lot of ways, and so I'm very understanding of the strong emotion that can be a part of this discussion about women in leadership. What we're going to talk about today is really focused on issues related to broader cultural and social issues that the evidence or the research suggests are issues. But before we start, let me just offer a few introductory comments about this specifically, but about complex issues in general, because I think it's really important to keep these points in mind as we talk about issues today, and as we talk about any issue. Any difficult social issue, any difficult community issue, any difficult organizational issue, some of these basic principles are really important for us to keep in mind. The first is that most complex and difficult issues are the result of complex and difficult to understand causes. Anytime we face a complex issue, especially one that we feel very strongly about, anytime we face a difficult issue that has some emotional investment for us, and this can be one of those issues, we want there to be a simple cause. We want there to be a simple way of looking at it so that we know exactly what to do. And the truth is that in most cases, complex and difficult problems have complex and difficult causes, and they're often really hard to understand. And this is one of those. Why we see this leadership gap. The numbers are clear, but the explanation for why the numbers are there, why the numbers are what they are, can be a more complex set of causal factors. So I think it's important to remember that. Second point is that even though we have lots of information, and I will throw a lot of information at you, even though we have lots of information about an issue that concerns us, that information will always be subject to our own interpretation. Not that we debate that the information is accurate, but we can debate why it looks the way it does. What does the information really suggest? So we can have a tough social, a tough organizational issue. Let's say an organizational issue of a drop in sales, right? We can have that information, but we still have to interpret the information. Yes, our sales fell. Why? Why did our sales fall? Why do we have low customer satisfaction? Why do we have high employee satisfaction? We have the data. The data suggests things, but we still have to give meaning to it and answer the question why. And we always have to be aware that there may be various ways to view, understand, and interpret the information. So, third point, the way we interpret that information is to a great extent going to be a function of our already existing preferences, values, and beliefs, which we don't always recognize. One of the issues that we understand very clearly in leadership, particularly in the area of decision making, is that as hard as we try to be rational, we are boundedly so. We have limits to our ability to be fully rational. And some of those limits include our already existing preferences. So we often view information in a way that's consistent with what we already believe, what we already accept as valid, what we already accept as a guiding principle. We all do it because we're all normal human beings. We don't do it because we're flawed. We don't do it because we don't care. We do it because that's what humans do, and that's what our cognitive processes lead us to do. What that means is that whenever we look at a difficult situation, like the leadership gap between men and women, uh, people can legitimately view the same situation, the same issue, the same condition from different perspectives, and they can interpret that available information in different ways. So that people of good faith really can disagree about the nature of a problem, the causes of that problem, and the appropriateness of solutions to that problem. So I wanted to present that just as an introduction so that you understand what I'm going to present to you is based on research. It's a summary look, the best I can, about broad social and broad cultural issues that I think are often underappreciated as an explanation for this leadership gap. But it's not the only way to look at the information. It's not the only way to understand it. And each of us is going to look at that in ways that make sense to us. But we have to understand that you know, our perspectives are often driven by our already existing preferences and values, and being aware that there are more than just one way to look at what this data suggests. Now, what I'm going to present is information that is reasonably well grounded in research. Let's talk about um, what I'm really going to do, which is looking at what research suggests might be explanations for the leadership gap, especially at more senior levels of organizations. The problem begins very early. So the leadership gap at senior levels is the result of 30 years for an individual, and why she, did not stay on that leadership track, and why he, as a male, perhaps did. The research is not necessarily conclusive. We're still learning a lot about this. The research can be interpreted and understood in different ways, perhaps. But what we're going to look at is what research suggests are issues that we should be concerned about. First, do men and women tend to have different leadership approaches? Let's just get this out of the way. Maybe, but I think it's really inconclusive. At least my reading of the research, whether they tend to lead in different ways. You have some research that suggests that they do. You have some research that says no, the differences really are very superficial, not fundamental. I don't know that there's a good answer to this question. Do men and women tend to have different leadership approaches? I think there's a good answer to this question. If there are differences, right, they're likely the result of deeply held social understandings, value orientations, rather than differences in ability. I just don't think we have any evidence that there are ability differences at all. I just don't think there's anything credible that would suggest there are. The differences in leadership are the same causal factors that lead to any differences in leadership, is that we're all different as human beings, so we approach things differently. The most important question is this final question: are there differences in leadership effectiveness? I think there's a really very strong no to that question. I just don't see any information, any research, any credible research at all that even suggests that men and women differ in their leadership effectiveness. So we're left with this remaining fundamental question, this remaining battle, which is this issue here. Women are highly underrepresented in leadership roles in most organizations, especially at what we would call the C-suite level, the significant senior leadership roles in organizations. Around 44 to 45% of the workforce is female. Right? However, almost immediately, this narrowing of female leadership, the widening of the gap begins. 44%, 45% of the workforce is female. Now that number has come down during the pandemic quite a bit. For, again, a variety of reasons, some well understood, some perhaps poorly understood. But this widening of the leadership gap begins very early. As the numbers of first line supervisors begin to fall, the numbers of women who are first line supervisors begin to fall. So 45, 44, 45% of the workplace is female. About 36% of first level supervisory, middle management, early leadership roles, early managerial roles in organizations is female. 25% of senior executive level, and then 6% of CEOs. And the question is, why? Why is this happening? Again, we see no evidence that there is a difference in leadership effectiveness. Why does this happen? Well, let me suggest 6 reasons. One man's opinion. Okay? These are not necessarily in order of importance. I just don't think that any of us are in a position to rank order these in terms of how important they are. I have my personal opinions of what I think is most critical, but I don't know that we have a lot of research that would support. Okay, so I do think, my personal opinion is that some of these more deeply social issues are probably pretty critical, but I don't know that for sure. I don't know that they're more important than some of the other issues that we face. I do think this one that we will talk about, occupational barriers, is one that we don't talk about enough, because I do think there are significant occupational barriers that are under discussed and under recognized as an additional barrier, as an additional explanation for this leadership gap. So we'll just talk about these. Again, these are not necessarily in order of importance. They reflect my own thinking, my own view of what the research literature suggests are critical issues in this. But keep in mind that this is a very fluid field as we continue to learn more. But for me, I think it provides a pretty good, pretty solid, at least initial understanding of why that gap exists, especially at senior levels in organizations. So let's start with the first few, dealing with social role congruity, prescriptive stereotypes, and then these social role expectations that emerge right out of that. What we mean by social role congruity and prescriptive stereotypes. A role, first of all, as we talk about it in organizational sciences, our understanding of human behavior, a role simply refers to a set of behaviors that we expect from someone who occupies a particular role, a particular position in life, society, organizations. So a police officer, doctor, teacher, mayor, politician, professor. That role, the moment we find that someone occupies that role, we assign a fairly extensive and fairly well-defined list of behaviors that we now expect, a list of attributes that we now expect from someone who's in that role. So you find out that somebody occupies a certain role. Your brain, because of experience, because of culture, because of shared understandings, you now assign and have associated with that role, and now with that person who is in that role, you have associated with that person a set of expected behaviors, how this person will behave, what this person does, how this person should interact. Okay? Social roles then refers to behaviors and attributes we expect from people who occupy particular roles in society. And that includes sex-based roles, males and females, behaviors that we assign. It includes things like mother and father. All societies develop these behavioral expectations around those delineated roles. Congruity refers to the agreement and harmony that we expect. So if we meet somebody in a role, teacher, doctor, mayor, politician, whatever, firefighter, we find out that person's in that role. We then have all these behaviors and attributes that we associate with that role. We now associate with the person who occupies that role. What we now expect is congruity, agreement and harmony between the role that the person occupies and what we actually observe in their behaviors. So what emerges from this, and this is research, and I'll the slide set that I share with Jamie that she can then share with all of you will include references to all of this if you're interested in reading what the literature and the research says. This is research from Alice Egley at Northwestern University, who's done what I think is really interesting work in what she calls social role congruity theory. She really is the individual more than anyone else who has developed this perspective about women in leadership, and she's using this social role congruity as an explanation for that. So what Egley argues and what she's developed in terms of social roles between men and women in society, and this is something that generally she finds is fairly consistent globally. It really is, it doesn't appear to be an issue that is unique to any one culture. What Egley argues is that in most societies, women occupy what she calls a communal role, which is the builders, the maintainers of the community. And therefore, the sets of behaviors that Egley argues are associated with that role are things like being kind and helpful and nurturing and supportive and self-sacrificing and benevolent. Egley argues that the social role for males in most societies is what she calls agentic, assertive, decisive, ambitious, self-assured, confident. Now, I think all of you can recognize if this is accurate, and Egley I think has some pretty persuasive evidence to support what she's arguing, is that now we have fairly clear expected sets of behaviors that are deeply embedded in our shared understandings about these social roles and this congruity that we expect. Well, here is what Egley argues is the problem. Okay. What develops out of this, both as a direct result of this research, but also as an independent stream of research on its own, are what we call implicit theories of leadership. Implicit theories simply refer to mental structures, shortcuts, configurations that allow us to quickly organize, sort information, and respond appropriately. We all have them. If we didn't, we would be overwhelmed by the complexity that surrounds us. Okay? We just would. Our brains are extraordinarily well-developed tools for sorting, classifying information, structuring in a way that allows us to act. Some of these mental structures that we developed are called implicit theories, and specifically in this case, implicit theories of leadership. What implicit theories of leadership are shared perspectives, expectations, and assumptions about what leadership is, what the characteristics of leaders are, what leaders are like, and what we expect leaders to be and do. They result from really complex causes, but are certainly influenced by shared cultural understandings. And they appear to be really, really stable. So, for example, this is research from 2018, just a few years ago. It's a replication of research that's 20 years old, and which was replication of research far beyond that. This is just copied out of the research article. These are the implicit leadership perspectives that we tend to share. This is 1994. This is 2018, so 20 some years later. There's very little difference between the two. And you can see these are kind of the attributes that we expect. Between, and the research is fairly simple. You have people sit down and you simply have them write out answers to prompts. Describe what you think a leader is. Describe what you think leaders should do. Describe what you think leaders should be. And you go through analysis of organizing that. And this has been very stable for decades and decades and decades. It just hasn't changed very much. Okay. Well, if you look at this, you can see that generally speaking, these are very agentic types of activities. If we go back to what Egley argued. Whoops, I'm sorry. Women as communal, men as agentic. If you look at these implicit character or categorizations, they tend to be much more agentic than they are communal. So we have at the top this sensitivity section element, which we could say, well, yeah, that's a really communal part of leadership. But the other things, charisma, tyranny, strength, masculinity specifically shows up as an attribute in these implicit leadership theory approaches. That is one of the major issues that I think we're dealing with here, and what some of the challenges are. So what these implicit theories mean, what the overall structure of what people consider to be characteristics of leaders remains largely unchanged. They're very stable over time. And most characteristics have remained really stable, including masculinity, that leaders are masculine, tall, male, and attractive. Right? That leaders are strong, commanding, assertive, authoritative, tough, strong, firm. And in other words, as this is research by Lynn Offerman, who has done really interesting work in leadership. I actually used her a lot in my own dissertation 30 some years ago. So she's been doing really high quality work for a very long time. Her argument is that basically leadership in many ways continues to be viewed as an agentic type of activity, not really a communal activity. So according to Offerman, this research supports the contention that there is still a strong tendency for leadership to be viewed as a masculine domain. And again, this quote from Offerman, which I really find interesting, it seems that appearance still counts, and that attractiveness in leaders is associated with men of above average physical stature, particularly among women. So what Offerman is clearly indicating here is that these are not shared. There aren't differences between the biological sexes in the way that we understand this. These are common across the population, regardless of biological sex or gender. So this, I think all of you can recognize, this is going to create immediate barriers to the way we view women as leaders, the way we view their potential as leaders. So what this means, quite simply, and again, it's really complex, and we risk losing some of the complexity if we try to simplify too much. But I think simplifying also allows us to grasp the problem in ways that make sense to us. The challenge is that probably in most organizations, much of the time, it is far more likely that a male will be identified as a potential leader, and as a result will probably receive more formal and informal development opportunities early in career. Mentoring experiences, stretch assignments, participation in network building activities. And the reason is that these role congruity issues, these role conformity issues begin very, very early. Because we still share, we have this shared cultural understanding about leaders and leadership primarily being a masculine activity. It simply means that early in the career, it's just going to be more likely that a male is going to be identified, because he more likely than not is going to match these implicit role congruity pressures, understandings that we share. Okay. Do I think this is fair? No. I'm not making a moral judgment about this, but I think it is. Now, role congruity then leads to what we call the emergence of prescriptive and proscriptive stereotypes around male-female behavior, what ought to be and what ought not to be. Prescriptive stereotypes, what ought to be, proscriptive stereotypes, what ought not to be. And this is what we see in the literature. With prescriptive stereotypes, what should be, and what we refer to as intensified Ali, I see your question. Let me get through this and then we'll go back and attempt to answer that question. Right. What we see in terms of these prescriptive stereotypes, these intensified, are behaviors and attributes that we consider to be really, really important. Okay. Whoops, wrong way. Whoops. All right, so we look at the intensified prescriptions for women. Again, very consistent with what Alice Egley has found in terms of the role congruity between as the communal role set and the male as agentic role set. Women as being warm, kind, interested in children, loyal, sensitive, friendly, clean, attentive to appearance, patient, polite, cheerful, cooperative, wholesome. Okay, some of these may make us feel uncomfortable, certainly reasonable, but fairly pretty consistent in terms of what research suggests. Intensified prescriptions for males: leadership-like, ambitious, assertive, decisive, strong personality, rational, competitive, risk-taking, intense. If we look at proscriptions, what shouldn't be, okay? Intensified proscriptions for women: stubborn, controlling, arrogant. Intensified proscriptions for men: emotional, yielding, melodramatic, naive. Relaxed proscriptions for women: in other words, don't, but we don't feel that strongly about it. Emotional, impressionable, naive, weak. Relaxed proscriptions for men: stubborn, controlling, arrogant. Let's stop now because I think Ali asked a great question, and the best answer I can give you, Ali, if we look back at that list, you're right. Since sensitivity has always jumped out as one of these factors. Again, this is the 1994, 84. This is the 1994 research. And it's been very consistent over time that sensitivities just jump out. So this is a great question. If this is true, then why don't we include more communal type leadership expectations? Why does it remain a fairly masculine understanding? In other words, as Offerman argues, leadership appears to remain a fairly masculine domain. Well, a couple possible answers is that independent of this one, lots of the other issues tend to be very masculine in orientation. Strength, masculinity, independent. Okay. So these would likely, in some ways, Ali, overwhelm this element of our implicit leadership approaches. So the dominant perspectives still remain masculine. The second explanation that I think is probably significant in this case: we expect our leaders to be nice people. Whether our manager is male or female, we want them to be nice people. They can be tough, they can have legitimate demands, they can be hard charging, but we expect them to be decent human beings, and just generally be kind to others. Okay. So this sensitivity, the way it's represented here, is not necessarily we're not making a distinction between men as being insensitive and women being sensitive, that we just expect leaders to be kind, nice people. No matter if our, who our leader is, if they're dismissive and rude, we don't like it. Okay? The final point that I would make here is that where this, I think, creates challenges for women is that it's far easier for a male to have some of these other attributes that we associate with leadership, and perhaps violate this somewhat and still be okay. And it's also easier for a male to have these and also be this way because we view it as consistent. The challenge is that it's harder for a female to engage in these types of more masculine behaviors without being really punished for it. So I think it's harder for her to find balance among maybe these different expectations in a way where there's not some social sanction for it. I think it's a little bit easier for a male to tread maybe these conflicting expectations. And you're right, these are somewhat conflicting expectations. I think it's in terms of our social understanding of leadership, not talking about individual ability, but in terms of our social understanding of leadership, it's probably a little bit easier for a male to manage this paradox than it is for a female to manage the paradox, just because we have different role expectations, we have different behavioral expectations. So that, I think, is a critical issue. I think the biggest issue is that we do expect leaders just in general to be nice human beings, and so therefore that shows up. But overall, the differences remain, as Offerman argues, a fairly masculine domain, a masculine activity. I hope that answers the question. I think it's an important question. It's certainly an important issue to keep in mind. We're not talking about clear and hard delineations between these behavioral sets. I mean, there's a lot of gray area, a lot of messy area around this. Well, what all of this leads to, these prescriptive stereotypes, the role congruity, is let's see, make sure I'm on my right page here. Okay, yeah. Is some research that offers some insights. And again, I'll send you these references. I'll send them to Jamie, and Jamie can forward them to you if you're interested. Some of this actually was summarized in a podcast. I'll send you the link to that podcast as well, so that if you just want to listen to the podcast, because the podcast summarizes a lot of this information. A really interesting research took place among MBA students, and the students were given two identical descriptions of a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. They were identical, except the name. One scenario, the person was Heidi. The other scenario, the person was Howard, female, male. Right? Other than that, it was word for word the same. Heidi, and this was across all these MBA students, and there were no gender, sex-based differences in responses. Okay? In fact, if I remember the research correctly, and I could be wrong here, so don't take this as anything more than my flawed memory, that women felt even a little more strongly that she was less likable. The students found Heidi to be less likable. She just wasn't as likable as a person because she was too assertive. Because as a female, she was violating the communal role behaviors that we expect. She was engaging in more agentic role behaviors. So she was violating some of these intensified prescriptions that we tend to share. Now, is that fair? I don't think so. But I think it is. And I think we have to recognize that shared understanding still exists. It's still there, and it has for a long time. Another interesting research suggests that we may view males as more authoritative. This was really fascinating research. People were prompted by a voice that said one word, academy. Then they were asked to write down the next word that came to their mind. If the voice saying the word academy was female, the most likely word that came into the respondents' minds, the word that they most frequently responded, was award, Academy Awards. If the voice was male, the most likely word that came into respondents' minds, the word they indicated, was school. Now again, let's not take this beyond its logical conclusion. Let's not make too big of a deal of this, but it does suggest that even the difference in a female male voice leads us to different ways of thinking about the voice itself. A female voice saying the word academy leads us to think about the Academy Awards. A male voice saying the word academy leads us to think about a school and education. That reflects perhaps some shared differences in the way we as individuals and our cultural understandings view the authoritative role of men and women. Right? Final piece of research you might find interesting is that women appear to downplay their career and salary aspirations to avoid sanction. Right? This was research conducted with female MBA students, and they were asked to express their career aspirations. They were asked to express their salary expectations. When they believed that men were watching and men would read what they wrote, they were less assertive. They minimized their goals, including their salary expectations. Now, what they concluded, okay, so this is not my conclusion, this is the conclusion of the research, is that single women operate simultaneously in a labor market and a marriage market, and that they believe, or at least through their behavior express a belief, that they will be punished in the marriage market if they appear too ambitious and too assertive. So what this may lead us to, all right, this, excuse me, I had a very itchy ear. What this may lead us to, and again, these are conclusions from this research. These are my perspectives about what we may be happening here. This nurturing and communal role expectation leads us to this sense of women as caregivers and homemakers. Now, I understand that can feel really uncomfortable. Right? The truth that I think we're seeing, at least one way to look at it, I shouldn't use the word truth. One way to look at it is that women probably face far more complex choices regarding career and family. And they may be more likely to choose careers and jobs that offer more flexibility. Perhaps, teaching and nursing, for example. They're more likely to leave and re-enter the workforce, perhaps multiple times. They may look for jobs that have reduced time demands, including part-time positions. Those may become more attractive. There is a much higher career dropout rate for women with children. Some recent research indicates that up to 1/3 of women with professional degrees who are married with children are out of the workforce entirely, completely. Another 1/3 are in part-time, flex-time positions. In fact, this research indicates that the full-time employment rate for married MBA mothers, and these are degrees from the more prestigious universities, is just 35%. It's only 1/3 of them are in the workforce full-time. Evidence does suggest that women with young children are less likely or actively aspire to positions that require significant increase of time commitment. Okay. We have the ongoing issue of the disparity in home care duties, though that's moderated in some years. It still exists. The complexity of childcare, but some of this does reflect what we call the express preferences of women in terms of how they're expressing what their values are. So the point is, okay, and we'll get to some more data later on that reinforces this, it leads to the issue of total work experience and total time in the career. At the end of 10 to 20 years, men simply have more years of experience and have had likely more significant developmental experience. That means in 10 to 20 years, after 10 to 20 years, there are simply more men in the leadership pipeline. That explains some of this. I'm not arguing it's fair, but I think it helps us understand maybe what's happening here. Let me give you this research from Claudia Golden, which I think is really fascinating. Claudia Golden is at Harvard University, mostly does research in the male-female pay gap, but that research applies and helps understand what's going here. And this is a quote again from her research. Or an interview that she conducted. I like to think about an individual who gets a degree, let's say a law degree. It's a woman. And now I have an individual, a man who gets a law degree, and they graduate from law school, and they're both equally brilliant. They both get jobs in approximately the same type of firm. By and large, they're going to earn approximately the same amount when they start. Again, her research is primarily in wage disparity. Things will continue in their lives. They'll both perhaps find partners, get married, have kids. It's often the case that women will leave the very large law firms that put in a lot of time demands on them and go to smaller firms or become corporate counsel because part-time corporate counsel perhaps for a while. They will go to small firms where the workload is somewhat different. They may work, in fact, the same number of hours, but they may work hours that are their hours rather than the hours imposed on them by the firm. The woman will then begin to make, if she's the one who did this, she will make considerably less than the man. And a lot of what we see, not all of it, but a lot of what we see is this choice to go into occupations that allow individuals to do their work on their own time. Now, again, Claudia Golden is referring specifically to the wage gap, but the basic principle I think also applies to this leadership gap. One of the many reasons for the leadership gap is the different choices that women may be making along the way for a variety of different reasons. Okay? So let's just talk about what some of these things are. Okay? This is the labor force participation among married women with children by husband's income. So you notice at fairly low levels of husband income, slightly over 1/3 of married women with children are out of the workforce. That labor force participation goes up. In other words, the share of women out of the workforce goes down. But notice how high it still is. You're still talking about fully 1/4 of that population out of the workforce completely. The result is you're going to have fewer women in the leadership pipeline. But notice where this becomes really interesting. As husband income increases, the share of women married with children out of the workforce approaches nearly 50%. And with the other research we have that in many cases, these are women that in other conditions, other situations would be in the leadership pipeline because of education, because of already existing experience. They would be in the leadership pipeline. We just have this narrowing of the leadership pipeline. We don't have nearly as many women as the initial raw numbers would suggest that we should have when we get to these higher levels of leadership roles in organizations. Then we have this research from Pew, just a couple of years old, just a couple of years ago. Women expressing their own values, which we're going to get into in just a moment. Okay? Asking about what's best for me, what's best overall. Notice that only about 1/2 of women working full-time believe that it's best for them. About a half don't think it's a good idea. What they believe is best overall, okay, 67%, fully 2/3 of working mothers believe that the best thing is to work part-time or not work at all. Now, it's clear, even in this population, most women with children want to work, at least somewhat. But it's clear that there's a strong preference, a strong value orientation toward more part-time, flex time types of roles, or 1/5 believing that the best thing is to be out of the workforce entirely. Again, what that leads to is this conclusion here, that if that's happening, these factors are playing a significant role in what's happening, this shrinking of the leadership pool that organizations can draw on. Now, that doesn't mean that prejudice is not playing a role, that sexism is not playing a role. I think we would be naive to suggest that it's not playing a role someplace. Okay? And it may be the most important role. I don't know. But this is certainly a compelling collection of research that suggests there are some really deep social pressures and cultural understandings that are at play here that are limiting and reducing the pool that organizations can draw on. Now, the gap does begin early, and I think there's some issues early in career that explain that. Okay. So these social role congruity, the social expectations, these prescriptive stereotypes, is it fair? I don't know. I don't know that it's fair or unfair. It just is. Right? And social culture is a very powerful force. Okay? Great question. What do men say about this? Okay? The numbers aren't really very close. Men express a strong preference to working full-time. It's not as strong as it once was, but most men express a preference for working full-time. Another way to look at this, another piece of the puzzle perhaps, is what we call the Schwartz value model. This is Solomon Schwartz, who I think has done the most interesting work in what we call values and life values. Schwartz argues that there are 10 primary human values. He's based in Hebrew University in Israel, has a joint appointment, I think, at university in Sweden. His research tends to be really global, which I really like because of that. And he finds that there are universal values that tend to be shared across societies, wherever they are. And the differences between men and women tend to be very consistent globally. So he's got these different value models: power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, self-direction, universalism, benevolence, tradition, conformity, security. This is what Schwartz has consistently found. Men are consistently higher than women on the importance of the following values: power, stimulation, hedonism, achievement, self-direction. Men consistently say this is more important. Women are consistently higher than men on the importance of benevolence, universalism, and security, usually but not always. So it looks like this. Men are higher on these, women are higher on these. If you look at the motivational goals that are associated with this, you can see it's very consistent with what Alice Egley, what we already talked about, the social role conformity. Men as agentic, women as communal. And this is what Schwartz found that's even more interesting. Now, before we go on, it's not like this. It's not like the female distribution and the male distribution are completely independent. It's like this. Okay? The distributions cross over. So there are a lot of men that would be in the female distribution, okay, on a value. There are a lot of women, females, who would be in the male distribution. The averages are differences, but that only tells us group averages. Doesn't tell us anything about individuals. Right? But things get interesting. The differences in men and women, or the differences, what Schwartz found, the differences between men and women on some of these values increases in societies that have higher gender equality. And by gender equality, we're generally measuring that by such factors as access to education, income levels, health outcomes, social legal protections, female representation in corporate, political leadership, so on and so forth. Right? In societies that have higher levels of gender equality, the gap between males and females actually increases on power, achievement, stimulation, benevolence, and universalism. Then more on this topic. Let's talk about the STEM issue. Science, technology, engineering, and math. Okay. Females are underrepresented. We've known that for a long time. The numbers have not budged. 20 to 25% of STEM graduates are female. Despite massive efforts, it just hasn't changed much in years. Just as what we saw with the Schwartz value model, participation in STEM fields is actually the lowest among females in societies with the highest gender equality. STEM participation is lowest in particular in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, with the highest gender equality. The highest STEM participation is in countries with the lowest levels of gender equality: United Arab Emirates, Tunisia, Turkey, Algeria. It's a paradox. It's called the STEM paradox. Why? Okay. One likely answer is that women are engaging in risk reduction strategies. That is, where women perceive higher gender or social economic risk, that is, lower gender equality, they make professional decisions to reduce economic, financial, and social risk. In societies with lower levels of social economic risk, that is, higher gender equality, women perceive less risk and therefore may make different career choices. Possibly, right? But you know, it's certainly an interesting issue. So what does this suggest? Some of the leadership gap may in fact be a result of differences between what men and women value in life. Right? Women do actually report much greater ambivalence about leadership roles in organizations. We call it the ambition gap. Right? It's there. It's measured. They don't want to deal with the pressure, and the expectations of the role are inconsistent with who I am. Right? Now, a lot of men also report this as well. This is not unique to women. A lot of men report this as well, but far more women report this than men do. What's the source of these differences, these value differences, all this stuff we talked about? I don't know. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it socialization? It almost certainly is both. I just don't know how much of both are involved. Okay. Well, let me share a couple last things that I think are critical as we're running a little short of time. This, I think, is really underappreciated, which is the lack of profit and loss responsibilities, what we call P&L roles in organizations. Women, females are often overrepresented in staff and support functions, for example, HR and legal. And they're underrepresented in roles with operational profit and loss responsibilities. They're not running a business. They're not running a manufacturing site. When we look at who becomes the CEO, they frequently have very significant operational profit and loss responsibilities. Women aren't getting enough profit and loss responsibilities. Fully 1/3 of S&P 500 CEOs have an engineering undergrad, which leads generally into a profit and loss operational experience. Okay. This is an underappreciated issue. Now, where is it changing? It's changing in retail. Okay. As of last year, late last year, there were 41 female CEOs in the Fortune 500. Right. about a third of those 41 were in retail. And the reason is retail does not have the same, that's the wrong way to say it. Retail provides profit and loss responsibilities early on because you're running a store. And when you're running a store, you're getting that profit and loss experience. So it appears that at least in retail, because the nature of retail provides early operational, early profit and loss responsibilities, we're seeing women then move up and take on those leadership roles. But this, I think, is underappreciated overall as an explanation for why we're seeing the leadership gap. Biology, I'll just touch on it. Look, we're not being unfair by arguing that the physical and cognitive demands of motherhood are difficult, and that women face far more complex personal choices regarding parenthood and career. Some of it related to what we've already talked about, but the truth is they do. The decisions are far more complex, far more impactful than they typically are. Prejudice and sexism, I think we would be naive to suggest it doesn't play at least some role. I don't know how big the role is, but I think we have to recognize that it does play some role in this. We all tend to be attracted to people who are like us in appearance, interests, understandings, worldviews, and there may be some role. If we go back to Claudia Golden's research about the wage gap, when we correct for occupational choices, time in the workplace, all those other things, that gap nearly disappears. Right? But there's some gaps still there. I think we could say the same thing here. If we were to control for all these other factors, the leadership gap may narrow, but it may not completely disappear. And what doesn't quite disappear, we might say, look, there's still sexism at play here. I just don't know that for sure. Okay? Well, I have taken all my time, I think, Jamie. Okay? Let me just conclude by saying this. The leadership gap is very likely a result of a very complex set of factors that interact with each other. And we may not understand these factors well or be able to control them that much. These social role expectations, the prescriptive stereotypes, the social role expectations that create higher complexity, perhaps sex-based value differences that lead to different career and occupational paths, the occupational, top jobs tend to go to people with P&L responsibilities. This has been all complicated by COVID. Far more women have dropped out of the workplace, and it appears they've dropped out permanently. Upwards of 1.5 million, it appears, women have permanently dropped out of the workplace because of COVID, and don't plan on going back. The result is that by the time, certainly things are happening early on, but by the time we're getting into middle management and upper middle management, where we're making more decisions about senior roles, the potential pool of women has shrunk dramatically. And we've got to find ways to increase that pool. But some of these issues may be resistant to change. They may be resistant to a lot of, perhaps much that we can do about it. Okay. And with that, Jamie, thank you. I will send an updated version of this with references for those of you who have any interest in reading some of the research about this. But thank you, Jamie, for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I have one quick question before we scoot off. I'm curious, you mentioned at one point a reference to Finland and another country, but in general, is most of the research that you're seeing, is this a stereotypical or a result based on US research? Is that something that is, or does it differ based on other cultures?
When it comes to the values, what Schwartz has found is that there are very marginal, very minor cultural differences. Those tend to be really consistent across the globe. Most of the research about women in leadership takes place in North America, just because that's where most of the universities are, Jamie. But what I've seen is that we don't see a whole lot of differences on what some of these factors may be. I certainly think we could look at other societies who we may perceive do a better job at bringing women into senior roles. But if we look at the developed part of the world, the numbers of women in senior leadership roles, it's not a big number. It tends to be a pretty small number wherever you happen to be in the world. Now, other societies, have perhaps differences from North America in terms of political activity and political representation. But in terms of sort of corporate organizational, I don't say that there's at least my look at the research is there's not a whole lot of difference between North America and the rest of the world in that regard.
Okay, awesome. We do have a few questions that popped into the chat. So one was, as a woman in a VP position in P&L with P&L responsibilities, their company has several women that are in C-level positions as well. She was curious, and how do we turn this around elsewhere?
I would say that what her firm has done is started really early. Now, again, we may see some industry differences in this. And not knowing the industry, it would be hard for me to respond, because we occasionally do see some slight industry differences. Some industries have greater female representation. The best answer that I could give is that her firm has probably done a really good job starting early and identifying women early in career. The first issue that I raised is this role congruity. That and the likely outcome is that men appear and are going to be identified as leaders, as potential leaders, more easily, more frequently than women will be. So one place, and this may be what this firm has done, is you start early, you start there. And firms begin to really expand their definition and their understanding of what effective leadership looks like. So you simply increase the number of women, you're bringing more women into that early leadership pool. You're giving them the experiences that they have to develop leadership abilities, develop their reputations, develop the visibility that's going to lead to more significant opportunities along the road. Okay? So I think that's the early start. The second thing is these firms probably are better at helping women find that career life balance that mothers tend to desire more than women tend to desire more than men tend to desire. So that I think would be two ways that you can begin to look at how do we find that balance that allows women to come back into the workforce that want to. Not all women do. I think the numbers are very clear that a lot of women express a preference to drop out at least for a while, if not permanently, and then go back part-time, flex time in some way. But the women that desire to come back more full-time post-motherhood, how do we integrate them quickly back in so that they haven't lost that 2 or 3 months or 3 or 4 years, whatever it happens to be, and we can still leverage their experiences so they take on those more senior roles. So start early, find ways to bring mom back into the workforce in a really in a more significant way. That would be off the top of my head.
Okay. And then another question was speaking towards your reference that about COVID and the pandemic.
Yeah.
And how are you concluding, or what is the research showing, right, since we haven't been there yet post pandemic?
Right. Yeah, and the what we're going on is when we ask the research that asks women what your plans are. Not all the women that dropped out of the workplace because of the pandemic, because of the demands of what the pandemic did, are going to stay out. Some are going to go back. But when we look at what they're self-reporting, a significant number are saying, I may never go back full time. Now, again, that's all conjecture on their part. So what actually happens in the next 3 to 4 years? But at least the initial evidence does suggest that a number of them are planning on more flex time, more part time, and not going back full time, or at least not going back to the same demands that they first faced. But we could be wrong on that. So I'm perfectly open to that to amend my earlier statement that they're not going back based on what the evidence shows in the future. But at least the initial evidence is that there's some evidence that at least a number of them do not plan on going back to the way things were.
Yeah, it will be interesting, won't it?
Yeah,
To see how
very
that
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the last question I think we have is, has there been research about women who are past childbearing years,
Right.
and then more women living longer, and
Right.
what that
Yeah.
is?
Kelly, I'm not aware of any research in that area, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. What we are seeing I think the past 15 to 18 years, at least my look at the research, is that women are becoming more entrepreneurial. In other words, entrepreneurial activity among women is growing as a percent of overall entrepreneurial activity. So what we might see, Kelly, is second careers for women, which is already happening to some extent. But second careers for women, as they drop out of the workforce because of retirement, or I'm tired of doing this and I want to do something else, an increase of entrepreneurial activity among women in that age cohort. But I'm not aware, and again, don't take that as an answer that there's no research. I'm just not aware of it, of any research in that regard. But it would not surprise me if we see an increase of entrepreneurial activity among women who are leaving the traditional corporate career path, perhaps an age cohort, but perhaps just an expression of preference. I want to do something else, and we have seen an increase of entrepreneurial activity among women because of that. That's the nub of this issue, this final question. That's what Alice Egley has consistently found. She calls it the double bind situation. What happens is that when it's easier for a male to adopt both types of behaviors and be okay. What's really difficult, and again, this may be unfair, and we can easily conclude this is a social artifact that's really unfair. It's unreasonable. It's what Alice Egley calls a true double bind. A female that behaves in very stereotypically communal ways, very stereotypically female, is then punished because, well, she's not tough enough. She's not decisive. She lets her people walk all over her. Okay? But if she adopts more agentic roles, decisiveness, assertiveness, she's punished for being too tough. And what's she trying to prove? And why is she being so tough? Boy, she's really a hard person to get along with. And then the one word we often use unfairly to describe women that we find unpleasant. And so that really is the one of the two or three most critical issues here. And again, it goes back to Alice Egley's research. This double bind. Women have a much more, or the view is, and you can easily conclude, that women have a much more challenging time balancing these competing behavioral demands, and that they cannot, if they go too far toward an agentic role set, they are frequently punished for that. And I wish there was a simple answer to that. I really wish there was, but I think we don't have a good answer. It is, and it's an unfortunate artifact of some of these shared social understandings we have, that women just face a more difficult aspect. I will forward a link to Alice Egley's Harvard Business Review article. She dismisses the idea of the glass ceiling. She says that just doesn't really make sense. We have no evidence that there's really a glass ceiling. What she argues is we have a labyrinth, a maze, a really difficult maze that women have to navigate in order to get these senior leadership roles. And I like that imagery because I think it reflects what a lot of this research suggests, that it's more challenging, and the stops and the starts and the dead ends, and getting pigeonholed over here for a while, that ends up at sort of mid-career with far more men in that leadership pipeline than there are women. Now, again, some of it are, to be honest, we have to be honest about this. Some of this is expressed preferences of women. When you look at those numbers of women who have dropped out of the workforce with advanced degrees, MBAs, who otherwise would be in the leadership pipeline, nearly one half of them are out of the workforce entirely. Excuse me, nearly one half of them are out of the workforce entirely as husband's income goes up. The only way to really understand that is that it's an expression of life preferences, or the best way to understand it. It may not be the only way, but it's an expression of life preferences. Now, there may be social pressures that women feel. I'm expected to be home full time. I'm expected to be the homemaker. That certainly is a part of what may be going on here. But at some level, it is an expression of preferences of how I want my life to go. Okay. This next question, Aaron, I agree with you fully. Okay, absolutely, positively. We had a big controversy just a couple of weeks ago about this. Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase saying that people who want to keep working at home aren't dedicated enough. The WeWork CEO basically saying the same thing, that people who want to continue working at home post-pandemic aren't really committed to the organization. So it's a broad issue, and Aaron, I think you're especially right as it applies specifically to women, because women do express a preference for more flexible time, because I think the truth is they are juggling more balls and keeping more going. The complexity of life is higher. That's a personal opinion, but I think the research also suggests that. And flex time provides the ability. And when I think we see the data, women express a preference for flexible work arrangements far more than men tend to. And I think you're right, Aaron. We need to see that express preference not as a indication of I don't want to work hard. It's an expression of I want to work differently than what you're demanding me to do. So I think you're absolutely right there. I think post-pandemic, I think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see it. It will be really interesting to see what happens. Some of us have missed the office. Those of us who are introverts have been perfectly fine throughout this. The fewer people we have to talk to, the happier we are. But there are a lot of people that really want to get back in the office because they miss that they miss that engagement. A lot of CEOs want people back. It's going to be a lot of hybrid work. So I think, Aaron, the model is going to allow flex time in ways that are more understanding of this is not a measurement of my commitment. This is simply a benefit that allows me to balance the many things I have to balance in my life, and I'm still committed. So I would agree with you. I think we need to view flex time as not a negative about someone's work commitment.
This is truly a fascinating discussion. So Dr. Ringer, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for taking the time to.
Well, thanks for all the commentary. I love the discussion. This is such a fascinating topic.
It is. It's great dialogue, and I appreciate your willingness to stay on a little bit longer to help answer those. But I think
Happy
it's
to.
really added for sure. So
yeah.
Again, thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Dr. Ringer.
Jamie, thank you. And I will forward my slide set with some additional references if people are interested.
Yes, so anybody who is interested, please let me know. We'll make sure we get that to you, as well as those additional research that you offer to share as well. Very much appreciate that.
All right. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.